Come on, doggy. Hey, what's up, everybody? Happy Wednesday. Hey, Snowy. Thanks for being here. Sorry about the background noise. I'm out on a street that's pretty busy because of rush hour. I try to keep the background noise down and mute myself as much as I can. Hey there. I don't know if anybody was just in Rudy's live, the moderate Democrat. I was on the panel, but unfortunately, and it wasn't Rudy's fault. Rudy did a good job of managing the panel. Just unfortunately, that our panelists were not, let's put it this way, they weren't interested in equal time for the panel members. So it wasn't necessarily them being malicious, I don't think. It's just that they were into it. There was one person on the panel named Shavera. I'm not sure how you say her name. And she's just a constant interrupter and a rude person, unfortunately. Maybe one day she'll grow up to be a little different, but I doubt it. So anyway, she's kind of an instigator and can't make it on the merits of the issues, so she's got to do that silly stuff. But no, the one thing I was trying to say on Rudy's Live, which I was hoping to ask him, and I messaged him, and hopefully we'll have the opportunity to do it again. I stayed on mute, didn't interrupt anybody as I like to do. I don't like to be disrespectful to other guests. But there probably are some lives where you have to kind of just jump in. So maybe I'll give that a try next time. I just don't like interrupting people. Anyway, so the thing I was going to bring up was, they were talking about, do people, condemn the H group? Should college students not support? I don't even think that question is fair, but the framing of the question is, why are college students supporting the H group, and should they divest from them or something like that? I think that's a false framing. I guess it's possible that some people support the H group and what they did on 10/7. I'm not one of them, but I also don't think it's my place to tell other people what they should or shouldn't do, or who the people of Gaza should support or shouldn't support, or even how the Palestinians should choose to govern themselves vis-a-vis the two parts of the territories. I mean, that's their decision to make. I try to step back and just try to make heads and tails of it all. But so what they're doing is they're basically putting somebody in a corner saying that if you support the Palestinian struggle, you automatically support the atrocities of 10/7. But someone on the panel did bring up a good point, and that is the context, the longer-term context of this is not being taken into account. And if you study geopolitics or any conflict, the context is everything. It is the only thing that matters, because if you isolate what happened on 10/7 in a vacuum, yeah, of course what he's saying makes sense. Like, the H group members were brutal, and they were disruptive towards Israel, and Israel's response is justified, right? It was seemingly out of the blue, so to speak. But we know that isn't the case. This didn't happen in a vacuum. This happened because of a response. And the thing I was going to ask him was, what do you think? Oh, there's a deer right there. Check that out. Hey, baby. Hi, beautiful. Wow, aren't deer so pretty? Just chilling behind a fence right there in the middle of the neighborhood. Come on, Ruby. Come on. Ruby? Hey, Ruby. Come on. I know you're upset. She likes deer. What I was going to ask Rudy was, do you think that H group is the cause of the problem, or are they a symptom of the long-term issues related to this conflict? Because my question is, why did H group form? Why did the PLO form? Why does any group form in the first place? They don't just have nothing better to do. They're not like a bowling club. They form because they have a common interest that they find, in this particular case, as an oppressive force against which they want to at least change their circumstances or try to resist in some way, shape, or form. So it's not for me to tell anybody, listen, in the colonies, back when the United States, before we were even a country, there were like-minded colonists. They weren't even U.S. citizens. They were subjects of the British Crown that had the same thoughts. They're like, hey, this is a BS situation. We have the British in charge of us. All of our taxes are going back to this greedy king in London, in England. Why should we have to be paying all this money to this guy? Well, he's not doing us any favors. So they had a common interest to push back against. Now, you can certainly argue the tactics of what a group does or doesn't do. That's fair. I would probably agree with people on the tactics. I don't want to see civilians hurt, but I want to make sure that's Anybody who intentionally or sort of in callous disregard for human life hurts civilians is equally culpable in my view. It doesn't matter how you do it or who does it. So yes, I'm against what happened on 10/7 to civilians, and I'm against what Israel's done in their response to civilians and what they've been doing for a long time, on both sides, I guess, but it's been way more on the Israeli side. But here's the thing: just like when you go to the doctor, a lot of times this is what happens in American society. The problem with most of us is not that we have high blood pressure. The problem is not that we have prediabetes or diabetes. Those are conditions that are symptoms of the bigger problem. Now, there are some people who do get diabetes simply from hereditary reasons. It does happen, it's rare. But for the most part, most of the illnesses that most Americans and Westerners experience is unfortunately self induced. Not that they on purpose get up every day saying, how can I ruin my life? But the way the environment is, the way that the food environment is, what's convenient and easy, and the workload, and just the lifestyle. People put things in their bodies that cause their bodies to have adverse reactions, in addition to the chemicals and the hormones and all the other stuff. But let's face it, most people eat a pretty, satiating diet, and it causes long-term problems in the body. Now, the solution to the problem would be to change that behavior, right? To prevent the problems from happening. But instead of doing that, our society wants to make more money. So they want to sell the packaged goods, make money off of that, have people consume them, then get these preventable illnesses, and then, of course, treat the symptoms of the core problem with drugs and surgery because they make more money, which is pretty sick if you think about it. So I believe that focusing on groups like H Group, the PLO, radical factions, the jihad, those are focusing on the diabetes and the cancer and the heart disease, all that stuff. But the core problem that causes these symptoms is what needs to be focused on. What is that core problem? It is brutality, oppression, occupation, and the original dispossession of land going back to 1947, 48. That is the original problem. That is the source of these other symptoms because there's no such thing as a resistance group if there's nothing to resist. Why would they form? Now, I've heard arguments that they form because of religious fervor, that they're extremists, and all the H group wants to do is convert everybody to Islam. It's a caliphate. Come on, give me a break. Give me a break. That has nothing to do with this. Secondly, they say, well, they're anti-Semitic. They hate Jewish people. That's also a crock of shit. There may be a few people that are anti-Semitic who lump everybody into one bucket where they use the term JEW rather than Zionist versus, someone who's not Zionist. But in general, I don't believe that's not the primary motivator. They may look at people who are in Israel with an angry face because they're angry at their circumstances. I think that's not shocking. But I don't think if you had a society where they had their own ability to live in autonomy and that they would have this abject hatred that would motivate them to do some of the things we've seen. I think it's born from an anger and a longstanding frustration. And here's the problem that I think folks like Rudy, although I think Rudy is well intentioned and I think he wants to see positive outcomes, and I appreciate that about him. But I think what folks who say things like what Rudy is saying, where he focuses all his attentions on eradicating a particular militant group, it is the inability to negotiate a peaceful solution to these problems and the continued turning of the screws on Palestinians by the Israeli military and government that causes these very responses that we're seeing, unfortunately. And I think we'd all like that. He asked me specifically, do I support the H group as far as the best governing authority? And first, it's not my place to choose, but if it were my place to choose, I would say no. I would say that a more repressive, stricter, fundamentalist government that uses, questionable tactics to fight back against its adversary is maybe not the best solution, although I've not walked in their shoes. I don't feel their struggle or their pain. And it's their choice. But if somebody asked me, that's what I would say. But if I tried doing things with a sort of a softer method and it just didn't work for decades, I think we'd all have to look in the mirror and say, hey, wait a second. Why are we going to keep doing the same old if it's not working, if things are getting worse for us? What else are we supposed to do, right? So it's hard for me to condemn somebody, at least the resistance part of it, right? I can understand the idea of not wanting to just sit in the status quo indefinitely. And so therefore, what are people to do is my question. If you make their lives miserable and you take advantage of them and you oppress them and you mistreat them and you unalive them and you destroy their homes and all the other stuff that Israel does to immiserate Palestinians, with no real reason, no real security benefits. The question is, why do you do that? Because then what does it do? It foments hatred, it foments anger, it foments resistance. So I think the fact that that's not being focused on is problematic. And the reason why I think that's not being focused on by people who are pro-Israel is because that gets to the root of the problem, which is not a defensible situation. It's easy to criticize what happened on 10/7. It's easy to point to that as the source of everything that's happening today, but it isn't. That is a symptom. The conflicts that we've seen are a symptom of the broader inability to negotiate a peaceful resolution to an issue that's been fundamentally unjust from the get-go, right? If you're for the Jewish state, and I'm in favor of a place for anybody who's been persecuted to be safe from persecution. I think that's the decent thing to do, is to support that. The question is, at what cost to whom and at what level of disruption to a region? I think those are equally fair considerations. And so for anybody who sort of paints the analysis and the criticism as coming from any other angle is off base. Because that's the only thing. Listen, all that really matters in any of this is that something good comes out of this. And I do agree right now that the H group is probably not going to be allowed to stay in power, even though the militants probably cannot be eliminated, and they'll still exist in some shape or form. But I don't believe that the governing authority, at least if the Israelis have anything to say about it, and I think they will be allowed to remain in power. There'll be something else that will come to be. I don't know what it's going to be. I don't know how much of the land the Israelis are going to take or occupy. A lot of this stuff's up in the air. But I just wanted to address that. This is about root causes. And it just tires me to hear people constantly stomp their feet and say, October the 7th, H group, H group, H group. You're missing the point. Just like if you blame the US politicians, oh my God, these damn Democrats, all these damn Republicans. What is the core issue? The core issue is not the placeholder politicians. They come and go. The problems still persist. The problem is, what is behind all of that? What are the power structures that drive all that? So it's a very similar thing. Everything's a symptom in our society of the control mechanisms that exist. And when I went on a panel today and they were talking about Biden and Trump. They were pleasant, by the way. They weren't adversarial. But I wanted to say so badly, hey, all this focus on one or the other as being the potential better path is so misguided, in my opinion, because none of these issues are going to change unless some of the fundamental issues get resolved. You can't say you want to have peace with your neighbor when you're shitting down your neighbor's neck 24/7. How can you possibly expect to have peaceful outcomes? That doesn't make any sense. You have to be crazy. Somebody says, how am I feeling today? Thanks for asking. I feel pretty good today. I didn't sleep very well, but I kind of rallied and did some work in the markets. Been working very hard on trading. It's a lot of work. A lot of work to do tonight. But no, I'm grateful. I'm just grateful to be alive and to be outside and just to do basic stuff, man. There's so many people in the world that don't get to do a tenth of what I get to do and what I have. So yeah, it's all good. So yeah, it's a little frustrating. And we can't make someone think a different way, but we can talk about different ways to think about things, and hopefully some of it rubs off. Some of the people that I talk to who are pro-Zionist, that are really hardcore, that maybe live in Israel, they're just closed off to any other way of viewing this. And I've had conversations. I had a conversation once with an older gentleman. This is long before. This is going back 10 years ago. And the word Israel came up in conversation with somebody else in the room. And I said, so what do you think about what's happening over there? And he goes, I think Israel's a miracle. It's a miracle. It's a gift from God. And I said, well, do you think that Palestinians feel that way? And he looked at me like I just literally cursed at his family or done something to his daughter. And he was so angry. And I said, well, in fairness, what do you think people who are from Palestine feel about that? They don't think it's a gift from God. For them, it's a nightmare. It's a living hell. So anyway, it's all perspective, right? The other thing I was going to talk to Rudy about, he keeps stressing the word terrorism, and that you can't have a terrorist government, you can't have a terrorist neighbor, or whatever. So what I was going to challenge Rudy with is to say, Rudy's from the United States. I think he lives in Ohio, and seems like a decent enough guy, reasonable, level-headed. He and I see things vastly differently on this issue. We may see things similar on other issues. I don't know. We haven't really talked too much. But I imagine there's some common ground like there is with most people. But what I think he misses is when he uses the word terrorism. He like this is what Dr. Phil said. Dr. Phil said on his show, he was talking with someone who was pro-Palestinian, and he outright said, as like a general disclaimer, nothing, nothing, no past history, nothing can justify or can excuse what happened on 10/7. End of conversation. There's just no more conversation to be had. I think that is a very short-sighted way of looking at this because it's easy to do that, to dismiss somebody else's point of view because you feel strongly about one portion of the long-term story. I don't agree with what happened on 10/7. It doesn't mean that I can't place it within its broader context. And yes, is it emotionally jarring when somebody attacks your country or attacks one of your allies' countries and unalives civilians or uses practices that you deem to be unacceptable based on your upbringing and your version of society? And but you got to remember, Dr. Phil and Rudy, the U.S. military is used as a tool to enforce policies that benefit us, we the people, around the world. And whether you do it in a dark room and you scheme it up and you run a plane into a building, or whether you do it through the CIA and you run a bunch of paramilitary forces and you drone bomb or unalive groups of people, it's the same damn thing. It's just called a different name, but people end up dead, and it's done through some sort of motivation by a group. So why do you look at one and you're outraged by it and call it terrorism? But let me bring it back to the United States. Now, during the Revolutionary War, the Americans did not have as many foot soldiers as the British, the redcoats, as they called them. They didn't have as many horses. They didn't have as many cannons. They didn't have as many muskets. They didn't have anywhere near the military capability. Very similar to how the H group is vis-a-vis the Israeli army and Air Force. I mean, H group doesn't even have an Air Force. So what the American colonists did, which was very creative, I believe, is to get around the limitations that they had. They used something called guerrilla warfare tactics. It's very similar to what we've seen in Vietnam when the Viet Cong used the tunnel system to kind of pop up, engage the American soldiers, and then disappear. It's like trying to fight ghosts. And similarly, in Gaza, the adversary to the Israeli military, the H Group and other fighters, used this vast tunnel system to their advantage as well as the urban terrain. And yes, it's a very difficult adversary to face. So I'm sympathetic to the Israeli military strategists because it's a no-win situation. You either bomb your way through it, as we've seen, and you end up unaliving vast numbers of civilians, and you use it as a justification saying, well, it's a war. Or you go in and try to do it surgically, which I think is the moral thing to do, but then you're going to lose a lot of your own troops because they're going to have to go face a lot more direct combat that otherwise you can just destroy using bombs, right? So let's go back to the Revolutionary War. Now, if you're the British, the way that wars were fought at that time, that military conflict was done with non-guerrilla tactics, was there would be battle lines. We saw this in the Civil War, right, in the 1860s. And one group would stand across, lined up man to man, and another group about 150, 200 yards across would line up man to man, and they would stand in line and they would take turns firing at each other. And whoever got hit, got hit. I mean, it's pretty crazy. You think about it nowadays, like what a stupid way to fight, but that was considered the honorable way to fight, combat. Now, of course, because the American colonists did not do that, the British referred to their tactics and they called them, guess what? Wait for it, terrorists. They referred to the American colonists who used duck behind a tree, go run off after you shoot somebody, as cowards and terrorists. So, is it fair, Rudy and others, to say, Dr. Phil, that the Americans should have fought fair? They should have stood up face to face and gotten blown away by the British Army? We'd still be under the British rule. We'd be paying taxes to England, not to the IRS. I don't know, maybe that's better now. Who knows? So the question is, where do you draw that line and where do you categorize a certain thing? If you're on the side of wanting to be liberated from your oppressor, like the American colonists, you're the freedom fighter and they're the evil occupier. But if you're on the side of the evil occupier or the legitimate occupier in your mind, and someone else who's resisting that is the evil terrorist, think for a second. Can you really have it both ways if you're going to be honest about it, if you're going to be intellectually consistent? So I wanted someone like Rudy to hear those things and talk about symptoms versus cause, like what's at the root of this, and then where does the word terrorism really fit into this, and what tactics are considered to be legitimate or illegitimate. And a lot of people are conditioned to think that anything that's guerrilla or suddenly done in a way that's considered to be civilians is completely unacceptable and has no place in combat or conflict. I don't disagree that I don't want civilians to get harmed. But again, there are different aims that come from different actions, and people justify what they do based on their objectives. So it doesn't mean that I'm for the actions. It means that I understand them within their broader context. Would I decide to do it if it was my struggle? I don't know, probably not. But it's not my struggle. This is the struggle of the people of Gaza and their elected officials, some of whom they probably don't even like, or many of whom. And some people probably don't even support what went on 10/7. They want to be safe and deal with life as best it can be dealt with, regardless of all the problems they experience. Other people support the concept of resisting, even if they don't particularly participate in or agree with some of the more crueler aspects of what was done to civilians that day. Other people probably don't give a shit. They're like, to hell with those people. I don't care what happens. Right? There's a mix of people. But it's not for someone like me, an American, to make a declaration that I quote unquote, condemn them outright. Because there's a mix of things that occurred. There was about a third of the people that died that day in Israel, unfortunately, that were soldiers and police. They're armed combatants. Okay, so it's not like they went in and ruthlessly slaughtered 1,200 civilians like at the end of a knife or a gun. This didn't happen. Now, along the way, civilians were unalived, and a lot were unalived, in my best estimation, by the age group. And that's, in my opinion, that's a war crime. And anything that may have happened to women is a war crime. And any other egregious activities towards civilians are war crimes. And they should be called out for such. And if the people can be brought to justice, they should be. Anybody who does that shit should be punished for that, I believe. But the Americans in Vietnam and the Americans in Iraq and the Americans in Afghanistan have done way worse. And they don't get punished. Ever. Ever. Or very rarely. And if you civilians, whatever the number was, that weren't police and military. And one is too many. But we're not talking about tens of thousands or millions of people. The American empire and its Western client states have unalived millions, millions of people at the end of US drones and military incursions and all sorts of mayhem, mostly civilians. So, how is it fair to call what the people of Gaza, the militants of Gaza, did on 10/7 as abject terrorism and firing rockets from their territory into their neighbor who's oppressing them as terrorism? But when Israel goes in with aircraft and drops unguided bombs on civilian, heavily densely populated civilian targets, that's not terroristic. That somehow is justifiable and it's just a quote unquote fog of war. Good. Yeah. Excuse me, my dog's going to try to eat your food there. Come here, baby. So, I can't open it for you. I'm not allowed to. So, basically, I'm sure the person who's got the food can do it for you. So, the bottom line is, people should think a little more deeply about this, in my opinion. It's not as simple as just they're bad, we're good, or there's a lot of nuance involved. So, anyway, can you really take anyone serious who says unalive? When I first came on this app, Betty, I heard that a lot. I was like, why are people talking this way? That's such a strange way to talk. It turns out that TikTok has an algorithm, like an AI system, that if you say certain words more than a few times, it stops the live and it punishes you for like a week or kicks you off. That's why people say that. So that is why people speak in strange ways on TikTok, not because we want to. It just becomes ingrained. In fact, after you do it long enough here on TikTok, if you're having a conversation outside of TikTok with someone, you find yourself saying some of these same things. Someone's like, why are you saying that? What's that? It's kind of funny. That's how it is. It's language. Anyway, I didn't want to do a very long live today. I just wanted to bring up a couple points and talk about perspective because it's such an important thing when you're studying anything. I mean, if you don't know, if you're someone who supports Ukraine and you wear a Ukrainian lapel and you're angry that the U.S. is not giving its more support to Ukraine, if you really genuinely believe that, and you're not a Ukrainian citizen who's being physically harmed or directly affected by it, again, there's a lot of nuance. A lot of what we're told by our media and our government does not include said nuance. They try to give us this childish depiction of black and white, good versus evil, that doesn't reflect the broader geopolitical circumstances and different interests of the parties. It just says things like this guy's a dictator, he's a madman, he kills his own people, he is a rich guy, he squirrels away all this money, he has the desire to take over the world because he wants to reestablish the Soviet Union, on and on and on. If you believe word one of that, you might as well wear a dunce cap because not a single word of that stuff is true. But that's the kind of ridiculous cotton candy macaroni and cheese bullshit we get spoon fed on our media. Yeah, Somebody says make Israel accountable. I couldn't agree more. I mean, I'm not talking about the population. Now, Rudy also said something earlier. This is not about Rudy, but this is somebody said in one of the protests, or says something in the chat, says, I can't wait for someday. This is not me saying this. This is what someone in his chat said. They said, the person said, I can't wait until the day comes when Israel goes away. And then Rudy said in response, how would you like me to say if I can't wait for the day that the Palestinian people go away? That was very telling because he's conflating the nation state with the entirety of the people that are in the nation state. And that's not what the person said. They said Israel. And here's where it gets kind of murky. A lot of people conflate a nation state with the identity of the very people ethnically and religiously. And they're all one and the same. This is the Ben Shapiro, Rabbi Shmuley way of looking at life. So, and that any criticism or any desire to see the variable shift is a complete hatred and anti-Semitic rant against the Jewish people, when nothing can be further from the truth. People can want to see the nation state, the way it behaves, the mindset that drives the brutality and the occupation and the exploitation and all the things we're seeing, and change the political dynamics and maybe even change the name of the state or the shape of the state or the leadership or how the population is treated, but not harm the people. See, that's a big differentiation, right? Now, should somebody have to come out and say that? I can't wait for the political entity that is called Israel to be shifted in such a way that the mentality that promotes Zionism and brutality and occupation comes to an end and that their adjacent neighbor can have autonomy. Give me a break. That's a lot of words to get out of your mouth to explain the same sentiment. It's not about the people. It's about the governing apparatus, the military, and the behavior of said actors, right? That gets lost in this conversation so frequently. And it really does. It really shouldn't. It needs to be emphasized over and over again. And a lot of people will call anybody who criticizes Israel a blatant anti-Semite. And you know why they do that? Because it's so much easier to dismiss and marginalize somebody and try to smear them in the public eye than it is to address the individual criticisms that in many cases are very legitimate criticisms of the behavior of a particular government and its military. Somebody says here, I'm suspicious that you have been researching geopolitics and don't acknowledge the fakeness. I'm not sure what you mean by the fakeness. It's a strange way to put that. But if you clarify that, I'll happily answer that. Average name, I think your name is. Yeah, I'll answer any questions you have. I'm looking back at some of the questions here. Well, Adam, I kind of started this on my walk home with the dog, so I got to kind of close it down soon. I got to make dinner. I got a lot of work to do tonight. But I wanted to just address the thing. I was in Rudy's live, the moderate Democrat, and didn't have a chance to speak. And so I just wanted to address a couple of the points that I was hoping to raise with his audience. And good for Rudy. He had like 550 or 600 people. So good for him. He had a lot of people. No, I don't think, by the way, whoever just said Rudy's biased, doesn't, I don't agree with that. I mean, I think Rudy has a very strong point of view in favor of Israel. I have a strong point of view against Israel. That's okay with me. And I think Rudy, by the way, today did a very fair job of trying to bring me up and try to keep it on the issues. Give him all the credit for that. His guests were the ones who kind of just took the air out of the room, which is fine. Sometimes it works out that way. But a lot of people in the audience were saying, like, let somebody else speak. Let Chip give a chance. It's okay. It's not a big deal. That I wanted to have the live get a chance to let these things out. I was hoping, like I said, to get to share with Rudy some of these other ways of maybe viewing this from a different angle. And then, thinking of it that, not that it's justifiable, but it's more understandable within its context. And that. And the other thing is, just this is just the way I try to handle myself, both when I host a live and when I appear as a guest. I take a lot of criticism, right? Anybody who's very strongly opinionated, or you're dealing with somebody who disagrees with you, most people are critical, especially, unfortunately, people who support Israel. Now, Rudy wasn't doing that today. He wasn't being condescending or rude to me. I give him all the credit. And he was trying to manage the guests, but it just kind of got out of his hands, and that's not his fault. It happens. I know how it is. But let's put it this way. I try to stay on mute, not interrupt people, I try to let people finish their point. Obviously, if someone's going on for 15 minutes, you got to jump in at some point and say, hey, can we have a little bit of a dialogue? No, not Rudy Giuliani. I don't know Rudy's last name, but he's got a handle called the Moderate Democrat. He does a bunch of lies. And a lot of the pro-Israel circuit shows up on his lives, one of whom was there today, who I think is very unpleasant, to put it as nicely as I can. She's somebody who I really don't enjoy her personality and her behavior, but she was on there. It's her right to be there and share her opinion. The problem I get into is when people don't share their point of view, they try to talk over people, call them names, not discuss the issues at hand, or change the subject when something is they don't want to deal with. You know, Rudy was trying to pin me down and wanted me to sort of condemn the H group. And my point was, I'm not a fan of the tactics. It's not my place to choose them. I didn't choose them. And I don't know whether they are indeed the best governing authority for the overall well-being of the people of Gaza. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. I don't live their struggle. I'm not from there. I don't know what they really want in their hearts. They may want someone who will finally stand up and fight, even if it's ugly and brutal, to raise awareness and to create a groundswell of public opinion, which I think we have seen happen, which is an arguable win for the Palestinians, even though it's been horrific in terms of the damage and the death and the destruction and all that stuff like that. So it's not my place to say whether that's a worthwhile sacrifice. They have to decide that. And I'm sure not everybody agrees inside of Gaza. But I don't think the source of the problem in all of this is Hamas. I think Hamas is a symptom of the deeper problem, which is the harm that was done by creating the state of Israel in the first place. It was a win for one group and a loss for others. And all of the subsequent things that have occurred since then that have been involved in occupation, brutality, war crimes. Not that everybody's hands are clean, but the vast majority of the violence and the repression has been done by Israel, as much as they like to claim it's not. And that's just how I see it. And I only see that because of the time that I've spent trying to learn more about it. I think that a lot of people who are pro-Israel, and this is not to sound condescending, they literally just do not know and have not come across the things that I've come across, because I don't have a reason to ignore it, and I don't have people constantly chirping in my ear telling me a different story. I've just been able to kind of comb through what's what, try to make heads or tails of it. And it doesn't matter to me whether something comes up that's unflattering to Palestinians or unflattering to Israelis. It doesn't matter to me, because I don't have a dog in the hunt. Whether Israelis flourish or don't, or whether Palestinians, it doesn't affect me directly. And people say, well, why do you speak to it so much? Are you getting, people think I'm getting paid? Listen, there are people in the world that speak to things because they believe they're either right or wrong, and they just speak up about it. I know that sounds crazy to people that are money oriented or feel like someone always has to have an agenda, or they're doing something for self-aggrandization or whatever it is. It's none of that shit. It's none of that shit. I talked about this on Twitter for a year and a half before I ever got on TikTok. And I've talked about it to people in the real world for a long time, like I told earlier about that person who said that Israel was a miracle. Had hundreds of conversations, not many of which went well, by the way. So, excuse me for a second. How you doing? So anyway, that's what's going on in my world right now. I do have to get off this. I can't talk too long tonight. But I want to do a quick live. Thanks for being here. I'll be on again soon. I'll talk to you all soon. Thanks a lot for listening.